Today I want to resume a message on the series, Exploding the Myths That Make Us Miserable. Today you want to look at that myth, if I ignore my pain, it will go away. I've tried this for the past couple of weeks with my shoulder surgery, and I found it is indeed a myth. So I speak from experience. If you have your Bible, turn to the book of James, the first chapter, verses 2 through 4. So beginning with James, first chapter, beginning with verse 2. Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. This morning I want to look at the truth about pain. America is a country in pain today. Everywhere you turn, there is some new relief for headaches, backaches, heartaches, and maybe most challenging of all, life aches. America comprises 4.6% of the world's population and yet consumes over 80% of the world's painkillers. But the pain in this room, the wounds, the hurts, that's what I want to speak to this morning. If only there was some magic cure, if only there was some breakthrough pill that could just touch and take care of the hurts and wounds and struggles that are so much a part of so many of our lives these days. I remember the first Sunday when I was first a pastor, my little seminary church. On a good Sunday, we had 20 people. And my first Sunday, I went up to begin the first ever being pastor of a church. And the little matriarch of the church came out and told me, "Preacher, we may look all pretty on the outside, but never forget that under every heart is a pail of tears." It seems whenever I speak on pain, everybody's name is on the envelope at some point or another. Friends, here's the truth for you. Pain is inevitable. Misery is optional. Pain is going to happen. It's just part of the territory. It comes with the human package. If you live long enough at all, you're going to know pain. And one of the worst myths when it comes to that is simply that myth that says, well, if I ignore my pain, it will just go away. I've lived that motto so many times in my life. I have to have one foot in the grave before I'm going to go to the doctor. And I just say, well, tomorrow it's going to be better. It's not really all that bad. I can handle it. Everything will turn out okay. And you see underneath all of that is another myth, almost every bit as pervasive, which says it's easier to avoid problems than to face them. Friends, God doesn't want you to ignore your pain. In fact, I believe if you will let Him, that He will want you to come to that place in your life where you can actually maybe even see your pain as a gift. Please understand, not a gift you would ever choose, not a gift that God put on you, but a gift nevertheless. C.S. Lewis once said, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks to us in our conscience, but shouts to us in our pain. And so what is God shouting to you if you find yourself in pain these days or ever will? Seems to me the worst thing you can do is simply waste that pain, because it's a gift sometimes that God can use for good in your life. And I want to just mention 3 different ways that maybe your pain, again, you wouldn't choose it, and God certainly didn't put it on you, but can be used still to build and mold something in your life. The first thing, I believe God sometimes just uses our pain to wake us up. I don't understand it, and I don't always like it. But there's no question, and time again we see it, that in people's lives sometimes it is the very pain that opened the door to God that simply never would even crack on some better, more ordinary day. One of the worst days of my ministry, my church in High Point, I walked in one weekday morning. A police officer was on the other side of the door, fully uniformed, a member of our church. I'll never forget what he said to me. He said, "Bill, this is not going to be a good day for you." Ashley Parks, 23 years old, just graduated from college, just starting a teaching career, just gotten engaged. The week before, she had shown me her engagement ring that she had just received. She was a babysitter for our two daughters. They think what happened was early that morning that evidently the early sun blinded her. She went across the median strip, head-on collision, and died immediately. Not long before that, she had stood in the pulpit of that same church and given her testimony. For years, Ashley had struggled with bulimia, but finally had overcome it. In her testimony, very clearly, she said, "I would have never known how the strength of God if I had not gone through the pain of my bulimia." You understand that, some of you. I know it in 2003. I've been a pastor for years. I've been a seminary graduate, pastored other people, counseled. When I went through a time of dark, almost complete breakdown and burnout, I learned some things about prayer. Not because I was supposed to pray, not because I ought to pray, not because prayer is a good thing, because it was my only lifeline to absolutely survive that dark period in my life. See, pain, it has a way of shouting. It has a way of just announcing, only God is God. And so can we let God be God in the midst of those times when God seems to be anything but a good God, when our pain is just assaulting us at every turn? Like a flashing light on your car dashboard. Pain sometimes can serve as a needed wake-up call. So don't waste your pain, whatever you do. So it can wake you up, but I think also it can make you up. Gordon MacDonald, in one of his novels, talks about a lady who, after a terrible tragedy, in the midst of her pain, just lashed out to a friend and says, "I wish I had never been made." Her friend very sensitively, gently responded, "My dear, you are not made. You are being made." We all know that classic verse in Romans 8:28. We know that God in all things works together for good with those who love him and are called according to his purpose. Have you ever been around some people who've never known any pain at all? Just float from one mountaintop to the next. Just wouldn't know what a stumped toe felt like if they had to. I mean, talk about people who make you suffer. People who bring you pain. I have a word for those kind of people: shallow. I don't trust those TV preachers with their megawatt smiles and perfect hair and trophy wives who say, "Turn your scars into stars," and act like they've never known a scar in their life to begin with. I don't trust them. Shallow. It's kind of like the woman who said, "I just want to die, but first I want to lose 5 pounds. Shallow. Very shallow. Yeah, I've turned 60 since the last time I preached in this pulpit, talking about pain. And I remember early in my life, times I thought life was so simple, faith was so simple, God was so simple, but I have a few dents in the body, a few skid marks along the way. And some things that I went into strutting, I came out limping. And I don't want to discount those limps. I don't want to disown those limps, because it is that very limping in my life that cultivated the soil of who I am, that allowed me to become more than I ever would have been if those things had not have first happened. We see this so often in others. I think of the great heroes of the faith. The only ones I can ever learn from are people who have been through what I call the laboratory of life, who really understand that life does have its valleys as well as its mountains. They're the only ones who can really teach me about how good and strong our God is. You know, I was out in Wyoming last year on my sabbatical, out in the middle of nowhere. And inevitably, I would meet people and tell the story and say, we are part of Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. And you could just see that blank look in their eyes, had no clue what Cooperative Baptist Fellowship was. And so I was just trying almost every time, again and again. Eventually, the light would come on when they say, is that who Jimmy Carter is a part of? They said, oh, okay, that's who you are. I think many of us have been given a model and a witness this past week. You've read the news, Jimmy Carter, ex-president, 90 years old now, discovered to have a brain tumor. And so what does he do? He comes to the press conference with his ever-present trademark smile still in place. And he says such words as, so I was surprisingly at ease. Now I feel it's in the hands of God who I worship, and I'll be prepared for anything that comes. Where does that kind of spirit come from? I think it comes from discovering what only pain can teach us. And that is that we will never know that Jesus Christ is enough until we some days are in that place where Jesus Christ is all that we have. Pain, first of all, it wakes us up. It can make us up, but it can also grow us up. Here again what James says. He says, perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, lacking nothing. The Apostle Paul must have been the greatest teacher of all when it comes to pain. Who can imagine a life like his with shipwrecks and beatings and imprisonments and rejections? And yet talking about all that pain, Paul is still able to say, this happened so that we might learn to trust not in ourselves, but in God. Some of you know the name Reynolds Price, longtime former professor of English and literature, writer of many wonderful novels there at Duke University. Maybe his best book for some of us is a book he wrote entitled A Whole New Life. It chronicles his long struggle with cancer. Back in the 90s, Reynolds Price started having trouble walking. And so he went to the doctor, and they discovered that he had an unusual tumor growing around the nerves of his spinal cord. They operated on it, but were only able to take bits and pieces from it. And so confined to a wheelchair, and with no hope of recovery, they sent Reynolds Price home to die. He said the pain was excruciating, month after month. On a scale of 1 to 10, it was usually almost every day at least a 9 or a 10. One day, Reynolds Price said he had a vision. Wasn't a dream, he insisted, because he was wide awake. But he envisioned that he saw it was early morning and the mist was rising up from a nearby lake. And on the lake shore, there was a number of men that were sleeping. And soon he figured out that they were the disciples. And obviously it was Jesus, and the lake he assumed must have been the Sea of Galilee. And so Jesus walked into the lake and invited Reynolds Price to follow him. And once they did that, he invited Reynolds Price to take off his clothes. And so they were there in the water. And Jesus cupped his hand and lifted it up and poured water over Reynolds Price. He said he had a long purple oblong mark on his back where the x-ray technicians had marked the spot to be x-rayed and where the incision would be. He said he could just feel the water trickling over that spot. Eventually, having done all that, Jesus said to Reynolds Price, your sins are forgiven. and walked out of the water. And Reynolds Price started following behind and stammering, said, but what about my cancer? Am I healed? And after a little bit, Jesus turned and said, yeah, that too. Well, Reynolds Price later shared all that with his doctors. They listened politely, but really didn't take it too seriously. They knew that he was destined to die, that the treatment wasn't going to be able to do but so much. But now Price found himself living in hope. It was a new day, a new spirit for him. And eventually the pain started becoming more like a 6 and a 5, and even certain times a 3 and a 2. And eventually the scans showed that the tumor, in fact, was going down to nothing. Reynolds Price lived the rest of his life as a paraplegic. He lived in pain the rest of his life. But he wrote about that experience, that he knew more about himself, about who he was, what life was about, where God was, than he ever would have known had it not been for the pain that he went through. He never wished for the pain, but he also realized he would never have been the kind of person he was, except that he knew that kind of pain. So I want to say to every one of you, your pain matters to God. And if you will let it, it has the possibility of taking you to a different place than where you began. Oh, sure, it can make you bitter, and that's a choice many people make. Or it can also make you better. And that's always an option as well. Paul asks the question that I ask of you, Galatians 3:4. He says, has all your painful experience brought you nowhere? Don't waste your pain. And don't think that if you ignore your pain that it's just going to somehow go away. Paul, in the midst of all his pain, in 2 Corinthians, he says, now I am glad, not because it hurt you, but because the pain turned you to God. There's a story I heard some years ago. It's always stuck with me, partly because I just don't understand it at all. And so it intrigues me. It's about a lady who was just going through an awful time in her life. And she was telling her friend about it. Her friend recommended that she maybe go on a silent retreat at a nearby convent. She had never done that before, so she decided she would give it a try. And so one afternoon, she found herself in the dormitory there at the convent, suitcase in hand. She was standing in the elevator. And just as the door was to close, into the elevator came a small, rather plump Catholic nun. They talked a little bit. The lady hit the number 4 floor button. The nun hit number 3 button. And the nun said to her, tell us, what has brought you to this place? It was just like unturning the faucet. She just let it all out. She said, my mother just died. I think my father's an alcoholic. My marriage is in shambles, and I think I'm just going crazy. Well, about that time, the ding on the elevator landed at the 3rd floor. The nun was getting off, but as she did, she turned to this lady and said, God must love you very much. Are you kidding me? God must love you very much. Here this lady in all this incredible pain, if someone would have the audacity to say, God must love you very much. What does that mean? That nun was making some kind of connection. I don't get it totally. I don't understand it completely, but I believe there's something to it. And I bet the Apostle Paul would get it. I bet Jimmy Carter would get it. I bet my friend Ashley would have gotten it. And I wonder if you get it. Whatever your pain is, whatever it ever will one day be, to hear the words, God must love you very much. Can you make that connection? Friends, our closing hymn, Abide with Me. Hymn number 63. So this morning, if there are those who wish to give their life to Christ, make your profession of faith as God leads you. I'll be here to receive you. There may be some who wish to unite with this church from another church family, or some who wish to make some renewed commitment of faith. I'll be at the front. Let us stand and sing to the glory of God, hymn number 63.